end of October. We're not actually going to meet on Halloween. I don't know if you guys noticed that.
So you can take your kids trick or treating?
What's that?
You're taking your kids trick or treating?
So think about it as a way to balance the classes that have had more Wednesday holidays or Mondays or whatever it is. There was a reason behind it. We'll just leave it at that. Okay. All right. So, but because of that, that's one less day to prepare whatever. There's we'll use the review day to go over the respiratory system too. Hopefully there'll be time for questions also. But make sure you're planning ahead for all that. All right. Questions about what's coming up? What we're doing? No. All right. So last time we were talking about blood pressure control. I think that's where we left off, right? No? Sure, whatever. We talked about how cardiac output is one contributor to this. Right? If your heart squirts out more blood, your blood pressure goes up. Pretty straightforward. And we talked a lot about cardiac output and what goes into it, heart rate versus stroke volume. Anybody have questions about any of that? No. Then I think we also talked about peripheral resistance as it relates to blood pressure. Sound familiar? If all of your arteries constrict and you maintain the same cardiac output, you shove in the same amount of blood through skinnier pipes, the pressure is going to go up. Okay. And then I think the last thing I sort of threw up there before we left was blood volume's contribution.
Yeah.
Right? So if your blood volume goes down, then your blood pressure goes down. But I don't think we really explain how we modify our blood volume. So let's do that. We ready? Yes, here goes. All right, how do we regulate our blood volume? Well, to decrease our blood volume, we can increase water excretion. We haven't really defined exactly what that is yet because we haven't gotten to the renal system or urinary system. But if we're going to excrete or get rid of more water, that essentially means we're making more pee, more urine. And urine is mostly water. That's formed by your kidneys. Where did all that stuff come from? Everything that's in your urine came from your blood. So if you're creating more urine, you're losing more water that came originally from your blood. So your blood volume goes down. And you can decrease cardiac output. So if you do this, this doesn't reduce the amount of blood you have in your body, but it reduces the circulating volume of blood. Remember that when your heart contracts, it squirts blood out of the ventricles into those arteries, it doesn't completely empty. There's still blood left in your ventricles. So if you contract that have a greater end systolic volume, there's more blood left in your heart after you're done contracting, then there's less blood circulating in your body. So that functionally reduces your blood volume. Does everybody see how that works? Have questions about that? Yeah.
So when you say reduces circulation, it just means it's moving slower, basically, because it's not like hiding in a pocket somewhere. You know, like it's not like staying in the heart and waiting for its turn or something. It's just moving slowly.
Well, some of that blood's sort of waiting. I mean, once it fills up again, it all mixes. So it's not like you're going to account for that individual water molecule in the blood. But if we were to look at sort of one beat at a time, right? Let's look at one beat where we've got a relatively high stroke or high cardiac outputs and stroke volume's large. So you squeeze out a lot of blood. There's very little end systolic volume at the end of that contraction. Now the next contraction, the next cardiac cycle, we fill up, let's say, to the same end diastolic volume, just to keep that consistent. But now we're not going to contract as hard. So now there's more blood left in the heart than there was previously. Right? That extra volume that's now staying in the ventricles, it's not going to stay there for a week. Right? It keeps getting circulated around. But we're not going to squirt out as much each time, which means some of that blood stays behind in the ventricle for that cardiac cycle. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? No. All right. How do we increase our blood volume? Well, you can decrease water excretion. So your kidneys are constantly filtering your blood, they're constantly making urine. Right? The Wednesday lab now knows that. Right? Monday lab soon will know that. You should be scared. Alright, so you can decrease water excretions. Your kidneys are constantly working to make urine. Well, what if it made less urine? If it makes less urine, less volume, that means some of that water is staying in the body. Where is it staying? It's staying mostly in the blood. And so if you're getting rid of less, but everything else is constant, for instance, the amount of water that you ingest is constant, but you're getting rid of less, then you have a net gain of water volume. And some of that water is going to be in your blood volume goes up. Along with that, you can increase water consumption. You drink water, some of that water can go all the way through, but you absorb most all of that water into your body. And when it goes in your body, it goes into your blood. So if you're consuming more water, you're adding more volume to your blood. And then, you can probably guess this one, you increase cardiac output. It's the opposite of what we talked about with decreasing volume. If you decrease end systolic volume, right, your heart contracts harder, squirts more blood out, it increases stroke volume. There's less blood staying in your ventricles, that means more is circulating around. You've increased your functional circulating volume. Yes?
How do, if you consume more salt or something like that, it creates more like osmotic molecules circulating in your body, how does that affect blood volume?
So if you eat salty food, right? So water tends to follow salt, right? So there's that. So you've ingested all the salt, so you bring that into your body. So you can have more water follow into you. And so this relates a lot to the lab, right? Because we didn't have a drink with salt in it. Well, Gatorade's supposed to.
Yeah.
Right, it's more sugar than salt. In the ideal world, it's more salty, right? And so you bring in the salt, but you bring in the water. You can maintain your osmotic concentration. Let's say it's in balance with your body, but now you've got all this extra volume, so you've got to get rid of that. Right? But if you get rid of just the water, well, that's a problem because then you become too salty. So you've got to balance both of those. And so when we get to the renal system, we'll look at that in a lot of detail about, you want just the right amount of ions, you want just the right amount of water, and you want just the right balance between the two. And it is a very sort of delicate balance, and there's a lot of systems in the body that have to work to maintain that. Between digestive, renal, and so on, yeah.
What about when you're sweating? Does that play into water excretion?
Yes, so when you sweat, you're getting rid of water and salt, right? So you're getting rid of both. And so that does play into this. You're losing volume. If everything else is constant and you just sweat a bunch, right? You can get dehydrated that way. And you can lose ions, which is also important, right? A lot of times people think of just the water that you lose through sweating. Well, that was a big problem. It's not that I remember this, but I've heard that in World War I, this was a big one or two, I can't remember which one, right? But one of those wars, it was a really big problem because people were, dying in the trenches. So that must have been trenches, from dehydration, even though they were drinking water, right? So you keep giving them fresh water, but they're still dying of dehydration. So what was going on is they're sweating like crazy. They're losing all the water, and they replaced the water, but they lost the ions and didn't replace the ions. And without all those ions, it makes it really hard to absorb the water, which was brought up earlier. If you ingest a bunch of salt, what happens? And that's the whole idea originally behind Gatorade, right? And those electrolyte drinks, electrolytes are really just salty water with a bunch of flavor in it, was to replenish not just the water, but also the salts, because you need both. Look at just about everything we've talked about in this class requires just the right balance of ions inside of cells and outside of cells, and the concentration of these things. Any that gets out of whack by just a little bit, your whole body starts falling apart. And so all that's really important. I don't even remember the original question where that came from. Did I address it? Yeah, a long time ago? I could have shut up a while ago. Sorry. Anything else? Yeah?
The animals eat only fruits. How they get their ions?
Animals that only eat fruits?
Yeah.
I would imagine from the fruits themselves. Ions that would be in the fruits. So, do you have an animal in mind?
Like, for example, some monkeys or some chimpanzee, they just eat only bananas or some specific fruits, and that's it. Maybe some leaf, but that's all they eat.
Yeah, so as far as I know, so I think there are some monkeys that are really close to strict frugivores that eat just fruit, but they're going to eat a diversity, right? It's, in cartoons or whatever you see, monkeys eat bananas. Well, yeah, plus a lot of other stuff, and bananas aren't always available depending on where they live. So they would eat a diversity of foods. And chimpanzees, I'm not a chimpanzee expert, but as far as I know, they have a pretty diverse diet, and they eat lots of different things. Even, I believe, eat other animals too, but I don't know that for certain. So even though certain animals, you think of them as, just eating this, like hummingbirds, you think, oh, they just eat, the sugar water that you put out, or they only eat nectar from flowers. Well, that's a big part of their diet, but they also eat insects, right? So there's other little things that they get in there, sort of trace amounts that can provide different ions or minerals that they need that they're not getting necessarily from sort of the main part of their diet. So from the diversity of their diet is where they're going to get the extra ions, for instance. Not just from eating bananas, but bananas, for instance, have ions in them. Right? They don't have all ions in them, but they do have some. Does that help? Anything else? Yes?
In terms of volume changing, I know we said average blood is like 5 liters in the body. Is this pretty minimal? It's not like dropping a liter if you...
Yeah, you drop a liter and you're in trouble.
Yeah, so this, when we think of it fluctuating, it's pretty unnoticeable.
Right, it's small amounts, right? So, this is all in regards to blood pressure, remember. So you just change the volume a little bit with everything else constant, and your pressure is going to change. Think about when we already talked about this, where you change the diameter of a blood vessel, and you change the flow through there. You're going to change the pressure by a lot. It doesn't take much of a change at all. You can get a pretty good change in the flow. So, yeah, we're not talking about losing a fifth of your blood. That would be a totally different scenario. Yes?
If you also decrease your consumption, and then that, of course, it decreases your excretion of H2O, then is the viscosity of your blood get thicker during the morning?
Tell me again what we're changing.
If you're just becoming really dehydrated, is your blood becoming more viscous?
Yeah, I get more viscous because there's less water in there. And so the concentration of all those red blood cells and all the stuff that was in your blood plasma is going to go up. So it makes your blood a little bit thicker. Anything else? Nope. All right, what else? We had cardiac output, peripheral resistance, blood volume, venous tone. So the venous tone, this refers to the smooth muscle in the walls of your veins, how stimulated or how contracted they are. So your veins have, at any one instant, if you were to sort of stop your blood flow, don't, if you have the option, but if you did, there would be a certain amount of your blood that's found in your veins. There's a certain amount found in your arteries. But that amount found in your veins, right, if you could change that, if you could stimulate all those veins to contract slightly, right, so you've got these veins and now they contract down slightly, so they constrict a bit, there's less volume in there to hold blood. And so then where does that blood go? We're going to talk about this with cardiac output, I think. If your veins all constrict so they're a little bit smaller now, there was blood in there before, where'd the blood go? Does it go back to the capillaries? No. So where's it going to go? It's going to go to the heart, and then what happens in the heart? Heart stuff. What's that? Let's think about it as it comes into the heart. Now, what happens to the walls of the heart with this extra blood that just came in?
Starts filling up.
You've got the motion. Well, that's something else, huh? Right, so you shove a bunch of extra blood in your heart, then the walls of your heart are going to stretch. and you stretch the walls of your heart, and then what happens? Right, then your heart's going to contract harder, right? So you increased your end diastolic volume, it's going to contract harder, you're going to decrease your end systolic volume, your stroke volume went up, your cardiac output went up, and your blood pressure goes up, right? So when you increase venous tone, constrict down, you're propelling all this extra blood towards the heart, and that's going to increase your blood pressure. So you can think about your veins as being sort of a reservoir in a way. It's not that you've got these big pools of blood that just sit there all day long, but there's a certain volume in your veins. And if you constrict down on all your veins, you're reducing that volume, making that blood circulate a little bit faster than it would otherwise, increasing the return to your heart, and your blood pressure is going to start going up. So the amount of venous tone can also influence your blood pressure. Right? You do have a big loss of blood, let's say, let's not go for a whole liter, but you have a big loss of blood. All your veins can constrict, so that the blood you do have, right, you can try to maintain some of that blood pressure to keep driving blood through your body. All right, questions about blood pressure control? I only saw your hand.
Oh, okay.
Somebody else have? Oh, sorry, you did too? You can wait.
So how does the venous reservoir actually come in? It's like, I'm not sure where that term came from.
So, you can think about your veins as being a reservoir, right? They're nice and wide, there's a little more than half of your blood volume at any one instant is in your veins. But it doesn't have to be there all the time. So you could constrict down on your veins to reduce their volume, to push that little bit of extra blood out into circulation sort of faster, you can think about it. So that's going to make your blood pressure go up. What was your question?
What would cause the veins to constrict?
Well, that example I had about if you had blood loss, right? You lost a big volume of blood, then your veins can constrict down. Also, just through veins that pass through, well, that's not by the muscles in the walls of the veins, but muscles around, like the skeletal muscle pump. It gives you sort of the same function, but just being more active can stimulate those veins to constrict and increase the return in the blood pressure. Okay, anything else? All right, let's talk about, so what we've been talking about here is really the whole body all together. We haven't been talking about different parts, we've just been treating the whole body as sort of one big box basically, and how we're going to adjust blood pressure for the whole body. Let's go ahead and think about individual tissues now, because blood flow to one tissue is not necessarily going to be the same as to another. You don't necessarily want blood flow to increase in one place and also in every other place. You might want to have some places have more blood, some places have less blood. For instance, if you just ate a big meal, you're going to want more blood going to your gut to help work on the food that's in your gut. Or if you start to do something really strenuous and you're going to go exercise, well, you don't need all that extra blood to your gut. Send it out to those muscles that you're working on, they're working with. So you're going to want to be able to distribute your blood differently depending on where you need it in your body. And this is all going to be based on metabolism. The tissues with a higher metabolic rate need a bigger blood supply. Okay, let's look at figure here. So what do we have here? It's sort of representing our whole body. It just looks really blurry. You can look at these different parts of the body and see what the cardiac output, or the portion of the cardiac output that's going to each of these. Right? So for instance, your brain's getting 0.7 liters per minute. This is all, let's say, at rest. About 14% of your cardiac output is going to your brain. Only 4% is going to your heart, 0.2 liters per minute. But then you can also look at how much is going to these different organs based on, or making it, the word just escaped. Mass specific. Relative blood flows, relative to the amount of tissue that's there. So maybe the heart's only getting 4% of the total cardiac output, but it's getting 70 milliliters per 100 grams per minute. So it's getting a good chunk compared to some of the other parts, right? Your kidneys, they're getting 20% of your cardiac output. A tremendous amount of your blood goes to your kidneys. Right? This is, of course, at rest. And but this makes sense too, because the job of your kidneys is to keep your blood clean. So you want to make sure your blood makes it through the kidneys, so you get it clean. You don't want your blood to accumulate toxins. So a lot of your blood goes to your kidneys. Skeletal muscle is only 21%, but you've got a lot of skeletal muscle. So 1.05 liters per minute is going to your skeletal muscles. And you can look at all these different parts and see that your blood flow is not distributed equally. All right, some organs or tissues get more blood flow than others. And this is at rest. But we can modify this. If we become active, we can really change how this blood flow is distributed. So here we have it at rest. It's kind of like what we saw in that previous figure. Then let's say during strenuous exercise, right, we can change all these. Well, we're going to have a lot more cardiac output to work with because your heart's going to start working harder. And how are we going to distribute all that? Well, let's look at our skeletal muscle. Right, we had 20% of our cardiac output going to our skeletal muscle at rest. Now we've got 73% of it going there. A tremendous amount of your cardiac output is going to your skeletal muscle. Right, it increases a tremendous amount. Your heart's going to increase also. Right, it's going to go up a bit. Your brain stays pretty close to how it was. Right, it had 650 milliliters per minute. It went up only to 750. Milliliters per minute. The percent goes down because we have a lot more cardiac output to work with there. Your skin has a dramatic increase in the amount of blood flow to your skin. If you're active, running around, why do you need more blood going to your skin? Your skin's not going to move you around. Right, it's for heat, right? So for thermal regulation. If you send a bunch of warm blood to the surface of your skin, you can radiate some of that heat out and lose it. Skin goes up. Your kidneys actually can go down a little bit. Abdominal organs, they go down a bunch. If you're exercising real strenuously, you're running around, you don't need all that blood going to your gut, even if you just ate a big meal. You know what? You can store it in your stomach and we can work on that later. Right? Or if it's really strenuous exercise and you've got a big meal in there and it's really just getting in the way, then what do? You throw it up and you can eat it again later. Hopefully it's a different one. Right? But if it's that strenuous of activity, forget about that. That's long-term stuff. We'll deal with that later. All right. So we can change the way that your blood flows to different tissues. You can send more to one place, less to another, and then switch that around depending on what your body needs. So how do we do that? Local flow control. Again, it's based on metabolism. So more metabolically active tissues generally are going to get more blood flow. Kind of hinted at this already, but the flow through an arterial that leads to some tissue, is proportional. So alpha here means proportional to 1 over the resistance to flow through that arterial. So what are we really saying here? Well, the flow and the resistance are going to move in the opposite directions. If you increase resistance to flow, you're going to have less flow. If you decrease resistance, then you're going to have more flow. Okay? We talked about this in the very beginning of the cardiovascular system, right? Flow is going to be influenced by resistance, inversely. Okay, everybody got that?
Can you walk us through that statement one more time, the flow arterial?
Let's go for a walk. All right, so we've got the flow through an arterial. There's some blood vessel carrying blood to an organ or tissue, let's say. Right? That flow, how fast that blood flows through there, is going to be proportional to 1 over the resistance through that arterial, or inversely proportional to the resistance through that arterial. So the more resistance to flow, the less flow. Okay? You ready for the next slide? All right, so let's imagine that we've got some large artery here, and let's say it gets 4 liters per minute blood flow through. That's a pretty big main artery. It's getting most of your resting cardiac output, and it's going to distribute its flow between 4 arteries. All right, let's say these are arterioles. Arterial A, B, C, and D. And each one is getting 1 liter per minute flow through. And luckily, if you add up all those, you get to 4 liters per minute. So what comes in equals what comes out. We're not adding any blood in the middle here, we're not taking it away. So far so good? We see that? All right, and there, in this sort of hypothetical situation, each of these arterioles is getting the same amount of blood flowing through. Now let's say we change the resistance of flow through one of these vessels. Let's say we work on arterial B. We're going to increase the resistance. What's going to happen to flow through arterial B then? It's going to go down. And then what's going to happen to the flow through A, C, and D? It's going to go up. We have to account for that blood somehow. So if we constrict arterial B, it gets a reduction. It's more resistance to flow, so less blood's going to flow through. Now we're only getting 1/4 of a liter per minute through there. But let's say we're still pushing 4 liters per minute into the system, which means we still need to get 4 liters per minute out of the system. Well, if we've got less blood flowing through B, a little bit more is going to go through A, C, and D. Right? So all those three each now have 1 1/4 liters per minute flow through them. So another way of thinking about this is this fluid is going to try and go through the path of least resistance, right? Water flows through the path of least resistance. So it's not that we're going to stop flow through here altogether, but a lot less is going to go through this skinny tube. So more is going to go through the thicker tubes, the larger ones. So how are we going to modify flow of these different tissues? You just constrict muscles around those arterioles to reduce flow, increase resistance for reduce flow, or dilate muscles to increase the flow through those tissues. All right? When you start becoming, you start doing some strenuous exercise, you're going to dilate the vessels that lead to the muscles involved. Dilate the vessels that lead to your skin, so you're sending more blood to these places. Constrict the vessels that lead to places like your gut, where you do all your digesting, when you're under some strenuous activity. Questions about this? Yes?
Is this the same also when you're like in fight or flight mode when the norepinephrine is being released too? Like you increase the diameter of your blood vessels?
Yes, so you would increase the diameter of blood vessels that are going to help you flee or fight,
Yeah.
and constrict the ones that you don't really need right then, like ones more associated with your digestive system. That's right. Anything else? All right. So what have we talked about so far? Lots of stuff, right? We've gone over the heart in a lot of detail. We've talked about these arteries, these veins, controlling blood flow to different tissues. That's what these little clamps represent, the little sphincter muscles around arterioles, so you can adjust how much blood goes through each of those. Talked about the blood coming back, maintaining or controlling the blood pressure, cardiac output. Any questions about any of that stuff? We've got one more sort of subtopic to talk about with vessels. And that's actually where all the action really happens, or what it's all really for. That's the capillaries. That's where all the exchange happens. All the stuff we've been talking about so far is really to serve these capillaries. So we can get blood to these places, so we can get material exchanged with all of our different tissues. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. The capillaries. Alright, we have a few different types of capillaries. The most common type of capillary in our bodies are continuous capillaries. Continuous capillaries. Keep in mind that capillaries are 1 cell layer thick. They're really, really thin. So you've got these flat plate-like cells, squamous-shaped cells, if that word is familiar, and they all form this single layer, and you wrap it around to form a tube. That's a capillary. Continuous capillaries have leaky junctions between cells. There are holes between these cells. So these vessels are leaky, very different from the other vessels, from veins and arteries. Those vessels are not leaky. You don't want blood to squirt out of those. But capillaries, right, where the cells come together, there are little holes or gaps in there so that chemicals can leak through. It's not whole blood that leaks through. They're too small for that. And we'll talk a little bit later about what actually is making it through and how that works. We also have another type of capillary, the fenestrated capillaries. Fenestrated capillaries, they have leaky junctions also, so they're kind of leaky. But they're even leakier because the cells themselves have pores through them. So think of fenestrated capillaries as really leaky capillaries. So continuous capillaries are our most common type. Fenestrated capillaries, we'll find those in the kidneys actually when we get there. Alright, so let's look at the drawing. At the top here we have continuous capillaries. So you can see this tube's made of a single layer of cells. And if you look closely between the cells, there are these little gaps that are leaky. It lets chemicals go through. The fenestrated capillaries have those leaky junctions as well, but you can see these little dots represent pores that go all the way through the cell. It just makes it easier for chemicals to go back and forth across the walls of those capillaries. All right, let's think about blood flow through our capillaries. This goes back to something we talked about with blood vessels a little earlier. If you have a high cross-sectional area, you guys remember that tube I tried to draw and it got bigger, and then you can talk about it getting smaller and how the flow is different from the velocity, the flow by volume versus the velocity. You guys remember that fun discussion? You guys were really excited about that one, right? So if you have a high cross-sectional area, you're going to have a low velocity through that section. You still get the same volume per time going through there, but if the vessel gets really wide, then it slows down. The velocity is really slow. In capillaries, have a huge cross-sectional area, so they have a very low velocity, which at first sounds ridiculous. Because remember, capillaries are the tiniest vessels. They're really, really small. They're thin, their diameter is really small, they're the most narrow vessels. So how can we say they have a large cross-sectional area? Because, let's think about the systemic circulation. All the blood that goes to the systemic circulation starts in the aorta. That's one big fat vessel. All the blood's going through there. That blood has to get distributed to all of the capillaries in the systemic circulation that are throughout the whole body, except for the lungs. Right? If you take all of those tiny little capillaries and you stack them all together, that total cross-sectional area is enormous. Can everyone picture that? That's the surface area we're talking about. It's so large that the speed that blood goes through these is really, really slow. Let's look at a graph. All right, so on the horizontal axis, we have the distance through vasculature. So we could start right up as we leave the left ventricle and go all the way through till we enter, right before we enter the right atrium. This top graph here has the total cross-sectional area in square centimeters. Down here would be the linear